The topic is building U.S. strategic trust, U.S. China strategic trust, and we've got. So I've got the honor of kicking off this panel. I'm going to introduce Mary Kay Dagestan, who will introduce the rest of the panel. Just a few interesting factoids about Mary Kay. Many of you have probably heard her on NPR. She's an award-winning journalist and correspondent, long-time experience in China. In fact, opened the Beijing Bureau of NPR in 1996 and has spent a lot of time over there for PRI and NPR. Her most recent project, very apropos of our setting here in the Bay Area and also about this conference, she's actually writing a book on innovation and how China is going to build an innovation powerhouse. So I will hand it over to Mary to kick off this panel. Thank you.
So today's panel is about strategic trust, building strategic trust. As China becomes an ever more important power in the world, it is inevitable that the relationship between China and the United States will both grow more important and also change in quality and in the types of interactions and perhaps in perceptions of each other. Whenever there is a rising power, various things are tested. Sometimes this happens peacefully, as when the United States grew in power in the 20th century and the U.S.-British relationship remains stable and productive. Often it doesn't. It's a core mission of the Committee of 100 to try to do all that you can to ensure that this is a peaceful relationship, a constructive relationship. And we're going to be talking here today about some of the challenges and some of the progress that's been made in building that, but also in some of the reasons why there is at this point a fair bit of suspicion from both sides of the other, where that comes from, whether it's inevitable, what can be done to mitigate it. One of the things we'll be talking about early on with our first speaker is a new report that's come out, Building U.S. China Trust Through the Next Generation People, Platforms, and Programs, which was done jointly between the University of Southern California, Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism, and Peking University's School of International Studies. And one of the interesting things, I'll let Chengguo tell you about it in just a moment, but one of the interesting things in it is that even though there's been more interaction, more interpersonal exchange, there's a lower level of trust in general, but the younger generation has a higher level of trust than the general population. So something to be a little concerned about, something to be a little hopeful about. Before I introduce the panelists, and we have a great panel here, I also want to let you know about a little feature we're going to be having in this session. Since some of you maybe haven't had your shots of espresso, this is keeping you involved, and it's interesting for us to hear from you. You all have these little gizmos on your chair. What we're going to be doing is asking questions as we go through our discussion. And one question I'm going to ask now at the beginning before anyone says anything. And we're going to ask the same question again at the end to see if the discussion has made you rethink that particular question. And the question is, I think we have it. It's going to be up on the screen in just a second. And so that you're familiar with how to use this, it says like 1/A, 2/B, 3/C. Ignore the letters. We're just going with the numbers. So if you think the answer to that question is 1, in other words, yes, hit the number 1. If you think it's no, hit the number 2. And we'll just give you a second. Okay, so the question is, following on from what I had just said, about sometimes when one power rises, it doesn't necessarily mean the other power falls or falls absolutely. It sometimes means that there are ways in which the two cooperate in ways that help them both. Maybe there's a win-win in some areas and it's a zero-sum game in other areas. This question is asking you on balance. Do you think the future relationship between China and the United States will be one in which one is going to gain at the expense of the other? And while we'd like to get your answers now, so if you can just go ahead and hit the buttons. Oh, it looks like we've got it. We've got it. Okay, great. So sorry, I couldn't see all the way over there. Okay, wonderful. So now let's move along, and I'll let you know who you're going to be hearing from here, and we'll be asking that question again at the end. So our first speaker is going to be Qingguo, who is professor and associate dean of Peking University School of International Studies, and one of the go-to people for foreign correspondence in China when you want to get sort of a nuanced, informed, balanced analysis of the Chinese government's perspective on something, but also of U.S. China relations in general. So we've talked many times. Dr. Jia has a PhD from Cornell. He's been a visiting professor at the University of Vienna, the University of Sydney, Cornell University, and the University of Vermont. He's been a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and at the Institute of Global Conflict and Cooperation at UC San Diego. Within China, he's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress National Committee, a member of the Standing Committee of the China Democratic League, and a guest supervisor of the Ministry of Supervision. He's also a member of the editorial board of several international academic journals, and he's published extensively on U.S.-China relations, Chinese relations with Taiwan, and on Chinese foreign policy and politics. And Dr. Jia, you're going to start with telling us about this report and what its implications are. And I'll introduce each of you just before you speak.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor to have a chance to speak here. Actually, the topic is very interesting. It's about China-U.S. strategic trust or distrust. What do we mean by trust? I think it's confidence in the other's behavior. You have confidence that the other, someone else would do the right thing. Then you have trust in that person, right? And when we look at China-U.S. relations, in our report, we find that as China and U.S. interact with each other much more than before, and increasingly so, our trust level has not increased. Okay. Actually, it has declined in recent years to some extent. Okay. How do we explain this? My personal view is that there are at least 5 factors in operation. One is that China is on the rise. So we see a sort of change in balance of power. Okay. And when such kind of a change occurs, especially China is a very big country, okay, a lot of uncertainties are created. Okay. So the U.S., Americans feel uncertain about what China is going to do, what that means to the U.S. China, of course, also feels uncertain about its relationship with the U.S. Some people in China think that the U.S. will not allow China to grow, to rise, okay, will contain China, that sort of thing. And of course, when they hear have a pivot policy, then they say this is to contain China. And then there is the question associated with this rise of China, is that China on the rise does not have fixed identities and interess. So in many aspects of China, China has dual identities and interests. Like China is a developing country, it's a developed country. China is a weak country and it's a strong country. China is a poor country, it's also a rich country. China is a strong power, is an ordinary power and also a superpower, at least in the eyes of some people. As a result, identities define interests. Okay? So China also have multiple sets of set of interests. They are in contradiction. For example, China has developing countries' interests, has developed countries' interests. So China has a difficult time of defining its interests at this stage. Okay? It happens precisely at a time when the rest of the world wants to know what China wants to do. Okay? If the Chinese do not know themselves, then they can't figure it out. Right? So they try to hedge against China. Okay? And of course, when they try to hedge against China, and China feel that it has to hedge against them. So we have a situation of, negative set of interactions between China and the United States. At least there is a dynamic going on. Okay. And of course, in both countries, there are prejudices against each other due to political and ideological considerations. Okay. There are people who are still in China who think that the only purpose of the U.S. on China is to overthrow the existing political system and have a regime change. Okay. Maybe in the 50s and 60s that was the case, but nowadays, but people still believe in that. And then in the US, you have people who think that if Chinese become stronger, they want to impose its own Chinese political system on the rest of the world, changing American way of life. That's unacceptable. Okay? So they speculate on each other due to misunderstandings. And then you have politicians who try to capitalize on the misunderstanding of the people. Demonizing China or the US is a very popular thing in both countries. Okay? You have people saying that the US wants to do this to us, and then in China, and then in the US you have people arguing that China is really up to something very evil. Okay? And they grasp a lot of small incident and try to blow it out of proportion. Okay? And finally, you have the amplifying effect of the modern media. Okay? The internet chat rooms and the Weibo and whatever. Okay? Whenever something bad happens, the news is for bad news, right? Whenever something bad happens, it gets exaggerated. And people begin to think, oh, this is the end of the story. Okay? Like when Defense Minister Hago was in Japan, was in China, he met the Chinese Defense Minister, and the Chinese Defense Minister said, what you said in Tokyo was, myself and the Chinese people do not feel happy about. And then the press, or at least some press, got very excited. They say, oh, you see, the China-US are going into the public in terms of their confrontation. But that's only part of the story. Okay? The positive side of the story has never been given into full account. Okay? Actually, in my view, China-US relations has never been better, okay? Despite all these problems. Remember the old days, we did not even talk to each other. And we did not have much shared interests. We did not have much stakes in the relationship. Nowadays, things have changed. We care about each other. That's why we have a lot of frictions and conflicts. And of course, it's like a marriage. Once you get married, you have the problems. But that doesn't mean the marriage is not a good thing, So you have, it's in China's interest, and also in the US interest, and also in the interest of the international society to get this relationship right. It's too important for everyone. Okay, so every one of us has a responsibility to make the relationship better. Thank you.
So within this marriage, one partner is looking to have more of a say, is looking to have more of a presence, certainly within the region. And that's one of the things that's caused a little bit of tension at times. There have been questions raised over the last year or two about how much of that is driven purely by geopolitical interests and how much of it is driven by the fact that there are also a lot of domestic concerns at the moment, and that this is one way of rallying public support at a very difficult time. Our next speaker, Cheng Li, who is director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, is going to tell us a little about some of the domestic challenges China is facing and how this plays into how China acts on the global stage. A little bit of background on Cheng Li. He has an MA in Asian Studies from UC Berkeley, a PhD in Political Science from Princeton. Before joining Brookings, he was the William R. Kennan Professor of Government at Hamilton College. He's currently a director of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member and former vice chair of the Committee of 100. Cheng Li.
Thank you, Mary. And I'm honored to speak to you and also speak along with my panelists and really distinguished China experts. I want to begin to echo what my good friend Dean Jia said, not so much about the metaphor, but the sentiment, but from a different perspective, that China poses a major policy challenges to the United States, largely because of what you said, the uncertain nature or unpredictable trajectory of both its domestic transformation and its foreign policies. Therefore, it is essential that for our policymakers and analysts to develop an insightful and balanced assessment of major issues confronting China. If our views or perceptions are distorted, our policies are also wrong-headed. Now, in my 5 minutes, I will cover 3 major issues I think that are most important at this moment. First, the economic or market reform started at the third platinum last November. Second is the ongoing anti-corruption campaign. And the third is China-Japan-US relations. Now let me begin the first one, the economic market reform. Before the meeting, I predicted the third platinum. This will be, I used the 3 B words, big, bold, and broad, to describe the change on the way. Certainly, the announcement echoed what some of our analysts, including myself, predicted. Actually, we were minority at the time. Now, there's different ways to define Xi Jinping's economic reform agenda. I think the best way is the term, the buzzword he used, the Chinese dream, which means that promote or make middle class happy, or give the opportunity for low class enter the middle class rank. Because the middle class was not happy during the past decade, although the reason is not just simply to blame Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao. This is not fair, it's complicated. But the middle class was not happy because they did not have any opportunity for investment other than real estate, which led to 3 or 4 major problems, namely shadow banking, local debt, overcapacity, and of course, property bubble. So Xi Jinping wants to fix all these problems. His roadmap is very clear. Start with financial liberalization. Allow foreign banks to have better access in the China's financial market. And that the private sectors enter the banking business already happening now. But you will see a major wave in the coming years. This is the first one. The second one is to drastically promote the private sector, especially service sector. And with all the policy mechanism, particularly in the public health care, education, and the logistics, and what the Chinese call green consumption. This is second area. The third area probably will take a little bit longer, not immediately. It's urbanization. Now, these are the policy agenda. Now, I'm very optimistic compared with many people in China, still very, very pessimistic. I think that what's the reason for my optimism? First, you may cynical how they can implement, but no one challenged the validity, the importance of these policies. They are right policies. We criticize a lot over the past decade, but now they're doing the right thing. Secondly, Xi Jinping is surrounded by a group of very capable technocrats, started with Liu He, Fang Xinghai, and now Deutsche Bank chief economist in China, Ma Jun and Wang Yiping. You're probably very familiar with his name. These are the world-class technocrats, financial experts. Some are domestic trained, most are foreign trained. And also, that Xi Jinping and Wang Qishan, these are leaders, as we know. In China, we call them the Dongjia because they are princelings. The whole country like is from their parents' generation. So they have better chance to crack down the state-owned enterprises. It's already happening. The head of state-owned enterprises is in jail now. Many industries, oil, telecommunication, and the railroad actually was dismantled. So I think the people worry that the resistance of state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are exaggerated. Now they said Wang Qishan, Xi Jinping are Dongjia, but the previous two leaders, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, are managers, are guanjia. So certainly Dongjia, the owners, have better chance to crack down the state-owned enterprises. But I think the most important reason is that Xi Jinping also outlined a clear timetable with what he said, 15 tasks, 60 areas, 300 policies. He has a clear timetable. Shanghai Free Trade Zone, 3 years. The interest liberalization, 3 years. There's so many policies, 3 years. Now why 3 years? Because in 3 years, China will have another leadership succession. This is much earlier than supposed to be, because last transition was half transition. You end up with previously they argued this will be the generation, so-called fifth generation who were born 1950s to replace the fourth generation who were born 1940s. But ironically, 2 years ago, they ended up with a group of leaders. Only Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang were born in the 1950s. The other 5 leaders were born in the 40s, only 3 or 4 years younger than Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, who retired. I actually created a metaphor called iPhone 4S generation to refer to them. So now they face the situation they have to retire. Now Xi Jinping needs to do something very, very important and to uplift public confidence, to gain political capital through economic success. Then he can make sure that he will continue the majority in the second term. So that's the stake. That's the reason that he wanted to do that within 3 years. So I'm quite optimistic. Anti-corruption is the second issue I want to address. So since Xi Jinping became top leader, 22 vice ministers, vice governors already arrested. This is what Chinese call tigers. You are yet to hear 2 major scandals. One is Zhou Yongtang. As we know, Zhou Yongtang is the former Power Bureau Standing Committee. The position is higher than Guo Xilai, who was only a Power Bureau member. But Zhou Yongtang's corruption is 1,000 times, probably 10,000 times severe. This is not just I create the term 1,000 or 10,000, but this is the statistics they reveal. $16 billion related with his family. Of course, Chinese government will not announce that number, but it's very, very ugly, very, very dirty. This is a guy control the state police apparatus for 10 years, the oil industry for 10 years, and control Sichuan province, for 10 years. 300 people associated with him already arrested. The second scandal, in my view, is even more difficult, related with one of the top military officers in the past 10 years, Xu Caiho. He was the person in charge of military personnel. Basically, he just sold the positions. There's a rank for senior colonel to major general, 10 million yuan, and etc. So this makes the whole military, it's really in a serious trouble. Now, certainly there's a risk involved. And in a way that the official behavior already changed. Not only just Xi Jinping fight against the tigers, but also what he called the flyers. So officials now spend less. Someone said that China's consumption dropped significantly. I think this is a wrong, observation. I think it's good things to stop this luxury, kind of spending. So what's wrong with that? I think it's a very good news, right? Yes, for the time being, maybe they slow down a little bit, but this is very healthy. Certainly, that some military officers may blame something or may try to start something. This is a danger. That some local officials may resist policies or do not want to do anything. But these are, in my view, could be changed because Xi Jinping very soon, in a year or two, will start to change leadership, the local level. So if we do not do it, that's fine, go. So I think that he has the kind of power to do that. But the most important thing is he got the support from general public and also from top leadership. Because the stake is, if we do not do that, China will be in big trouble. So that statement can sell extremely well. So people, even leaders, may hesitate to support him, will support him. So this is the second area. I'm cautiously optimistic in that area. We will see, probably in the next few months, you will see a lot of sensational news. But in reality, I'm not that pessimistic. I think in a way, Zhou Yongkang was more severe the case than Bo Xilai, but Bo Xilai represents a movement. Zhou Yongkang did not represent the social movement. So in that regard, I think that there's a good chance leadership will succeed on that. Now finally, the China-U.S.-Japan relations. I think all three countries are playing a very dangerous game. Borrowing my colleague Jeff Beda, who served as the chief assistant for Obama on Asia policy, he basically said this is really bizarre. The world's second largest economy and the third largest economy, China and Japan, are risking to be engaging in a war or military conflict because some, pieces of rocks, empty rocks, no use, useless. And the largest economy, United States, also highly likely, based on the President Obama's visit, will be pulled into that military conflict. Isn't that bizarre? No leader, I think, in these three countries want to have war. But as we know, history repeatedly shows sometimes not because leaders want to war, then they go to war. Sometimes incidents, one after another, will put the leadership in such a corner. Now, overall theme of this panel is trust. I think it's really too much to ask about trust at this point. I would rather to go with two other terms. The term Lin Jia used, understanding, and also the term that I would like to use is respect. We should respect each other. Chinese also should respect the Japanese. And not just belittle them, always little Japan, these kind of things. I think it's very, very troubling. But also Chinese should understand, not the entire Japan, the country, want to engage in military or remilitarization, but only a small number of politicians. But at the same time, the United States should have better understanding Xi Jinping, what kind of challenges face. And Obama, First Lady's visit to China is really well received. But the whole thing is just like it's collapsed with the Secretary of Defense Hagel's visit and now with President Obama's visit. So I will go back to the point is that the early session mentioned that China provides tremendous economic opportunities. It's a new wave of China's contribution to the global economy, just a start with a new kind of business model, new consumption model, which China could be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So therefore, United States should review our Asia policy. And sometimes that really should communicate better and really look at what's our vital interest, avoid this kind of silliness to continue to let the area to be obsessed with nationalism. And let me stop here.
Following on from that quite naturally is our next speaker, David Lampton, who also goes by Mike, David M. Lampton. He is at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he is the Hyman Professor and Director of the China and China Studies program there. He was also previously president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And among his books are the 3 Cases of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds. So talking about geopolitical power is right up his alley. And his most recent book, which came out a few months ago, is called Following the Leader Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, which looks at how the attitudes and ideas of those at the top have evolved over the past 4 decades. And he also had an article in Foreign Affairs on the same topic. So, David, is this a matter of, sort of inevitable tensions that happen as one power rises and tests another? Are there misunderstandings? Is there room to come at this relationship differently to avoid conflict?
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank the Committee of 100 for building bridges and trying to promote public understanding, and I think that's what we need in the United States. And I would say to my friends from China, we need more public understanding in China as well. I might start with the bottom line. Chengwei said the U.S. needs to revise its policy. I think the United States and China need to revise their policy. I don't think we're on a particularly good track on the strategic side. I sort of look at U.S. China relations as a 3-legged stool. Our economic relationship, I think, we're always going to have frictions. I don't worry too much about that, frankly. I think it's very strong. U.S. exports grew 10.5% last year. We have a trade deficit, we've got currency problems, we have all that, but I don't worry about that very much, because I think we know, broadly speaking, how to manage it. The cultural relationship's in terrific shape, I think, in many respects. 235,000 Chinese students in tertiary education here. We don't even know how many are in K through 12. And then visiting scholars, I wouldn't even begin to put a number on that. We need to get more Americans to China. But the cultural leg of this 3-legged stool, I think, is pretty solid. But what's worrying me is that 3rd leg, the strategic one, the one that brought us together, admittedly shared concerns with the Soviet Union. And then later, Jiang Zemin was intelligent enough to see that counterterrorism could provide a rationale for cooperation. But I think we've really lost our strategic way, both of us. And I think that's where I'm not a security type. I don't spend most of my time thinking in this, but unfortunately, I think we all have to spend more time thinking about that 3rd leg of the stool and how to strengthen it. Now, I've been really asked 2 questions. What's driving U.S. and Chinese foreign policy? And what do we do about it? So let me just tick off, because I want to stick with my 5 minutes, what I think's driving. Because if you're going to fix a problem, you have to know what the problem is. And it's complicated and multifaceted in both of our countries. If I look at what I think is driving as an outsider, Chinese foreign policy, I'd put the following things. Certainly public opinion in China is playing a major role, and all this data we had about the role of the internet and so on translates also into a political dimension. And I think we make a big mistake if we don't understand China's leaders respond to this also in the foreign policy area. So public opinion, I think, is important. Bureaucratic politics, let's be clear. China is building a military-industrial complex of modest proportion, but nonetheless is building an industry in this area. It has a PLA with 2.3 million people, and they have interests, just like the U.S. military and security apparatus here. And they play off of each other. So we've got that kind of factor. We have a sense in China, as was mentioned, that the U.S. has, as a matter of national policy, containing China. Now, I think at one level that's clearly not true if you compare it to containment of the Soviet Union. I mean, just the economic relationship would suggest that there's something different here. But nonetheless, there is a strongly felt, and I don't think China's leaders and citizens, as far as I can see, disagree about their basic vision of a U.S. foreign policy. And I think the administration made a mistake allowing their policy to be what I think was misunderstood but I think there was, at best, a messaging problem. But actually, I think it's probably more than a messaging problem. Certainly the mass media, more commercialized, more populistic, competing for readers and eyeballs, a tendency in China towards the dramatic, and then frequently the propaganda apparatus in China doesn't help. To say it doesn't help is a pretty diplomatic way of putting what I actually think. So we've got a lot of factors on the Chinese side. The U.S. side has its complications, and let me just tick them off. Start with gerrymandered congressional districts, where we've got a political system that doesn't reflect the center. The American people have common sense, but our political system isn't organized to reflect it. And that is certainly a major problem. Certainly, I think there's a widespread misunderstanding in public opinion that if you look at the Gallup polls over the last few years, Americans actually think China is the leading economic power in the world and destined to be the strongest. Absolutely no recognition of all the problems China has. I don't think there's an American in this room that would want to trade the problems of China for ours. So, we've got to get our act together. We've got our problems. But this what I would call excessive concern with the rise of China, was great opportunity. It's strange for me to be saying throttle back here a little, but I think there is an insufficient recognition of the problems China has popularly, and therefore an unnecessary, not entirely unnecessary, but an exaggerated sense of concern. Another factor is, unfortunately, and I think this speaks to China's foreign policy, we have a lot of powers or countries in East Asia that are seeking security under the U.S. umbrella because, frankly, they're afraid of China. And if China wants to take the steam out of the U.S. pivot, then I would say improve your relations with your neighbors. It's the single biggest thing. But the U.S. is reacting to what we're hearing with our allies and with others around China's periphery. And then I would say, and it was mentioned earlier, frankly, both of our political systems, us through elections, China through power concentration and competition in the elite, reward tough talk. Tough talk is popular in both countries. And there's a lot of demagoguery going on in both countries. So what we've got is two political systems, very complicated and uncertain world, a region that's reacting against China, which is very close and worrisome to them. And the question is, how are we going to manage that situation? So that gets us to what we do. And I'll just end because this is too short and we got more questions. But I think the first thing to do, China repairs its relations with its neighbors, and secondly, we get our house in order. Because when we're not happy with ourselves, we're not happy with others. And we're not doing the job we ought to be doing on education, on infrastructure, on research and development. And I think if we increase our comprehensive national power, we'll be more confident. China will respect us more, frankly. And I think that's the way we need to move strategically. Easily said, not easily done. Yeah.
And finally, our final speaker is Eric X. Lee, who is the founder and managing director of the venture capital group Chengwei Capital, which invests in entrepreneurial companies in the global Chinese economy. Eric is also an eloquent and provocative speaker on challenging the idea that China's future necessarily leads toward democracy. In fact, he's made the case that China's current system serves China well, possibly serves China better than America's system is serving itself. And Eric's going to speak a bit perhaps about that, but also about some of the misperceptions that there are between the U.S. and China Chinese of Americans, and of America, Americans of China, and Chinese, that lead to there being a dearth of trust, a deficit of trust?
Thank you. Good morning, Mary. I'd like to start, I think, regarding trust. I have good news and bad news. I'm a venture capitalist, so I'm used to starting with the bad news. The bad news is, I think, in the current context, trust is not possible. The good news is trust is not relevant. Who needs it? Now, I think the fundamental, the fault line here between the United States and China is that the two countries pursue and build their foreign policies on two fundamentally divergent worldviews. The American worldview is built on a narrative of political, economic, and social convergence, what we know as globalization, which began at the end of the Cold War. And the idea is that we build a global architecture with America at the helm, running it, underwriting it, in fact. And all the nations in the world are going to gradually converge onto that global architecture with the same set of rules on trade, finance, governance, military defense, what have you. And of course, just like in any country, when you have a set of rules, it will be meaningless without a policeman to enforce it in the court to judge who is right and who is wrong. And of course, in the world, in America's vision, America is that, plays that role. I call it the American Leviathan, to borrow from Hobbes, in the Hobbesian world, where all the parties think that they're hurting each other, so they'll submit themselves to Leviathan. And now that's the American vision, American worldview, and it's been happening since the end of the Cold War. Now, China has a fundamentally different worldview. China wants to do what's best for the Chinese. And China's goal, of course, so they emerged at the end of the Cold War as a very poor agrarian nation, facing this global architecture being led and built by the United States. So they said, okay, we're going to engage this globalization project, but on our own terms. On our own terms. We're going to do what's best for our own people. And of course, in one generation's time, it went from this very poor agrarian country to the second largest economy in the world, an industrial powerhouse, the largest trading nation in the world. So China took advantage of the global architecture that America and its allies have led in building and paid for. So many people call China a free rider. It's probably the biggest free rider in history. But only a fool would turn down a free ride, right? So China has done a brilliant job free riding on the system. So these two divergent worldviews actually have worked well together for a period of time, for a generation's time, since the end of the Cold War till recently. Now, each have used the system to serve their own purposes. Now, we're at the end of that phase, I think. We're at a point where the free rider has grown so big and so heavy that it's crushing the bus and killing the driver. Now, in only one generation, America is hot on pursuit of this global dream, right? In one generation, it went from the only superpower in the world to deeply in debt. Its industry is being hollowed out. Middle class income has been dropping consistently with no hope of revival. Infrastructure is badly in disrepair, and most importantly, the social contract, American social contract, is under the greatest threat since the Great Depression. So you have a country where the elites, the very wealthy, the elites, their interest in this globalization process, where China took advantage of, their interests, American elites, their interests have risen above the interests of the American nation. Their interests are so global. Yet the middle America, their interests are disconnected from that globalization project. America is run by what I call the American Trinity. And the American Trinity consists of Wall Street, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley. Altogether, employ no more than probably 1 million people, including their nannies. And these people reap the vast majority, maybe 90% of the benefits of this global architecture that's being paid for and sustained and underwritten by the American people. So I think in America, so we're at the end of that phase because the biggest problem is happening here. There's a schism in America where the elites want to keep this going, keep the good time going, keep the global system going. And I think the American people eventually are going to ask for their country back. Now, and we're already seeing it. America, in fact, is retreating from the world on multiple fronts. And the term pivot really says it all. You can, by definition, you can only pivot in one direction at a time. Right? So you can't cover the globe anymore. So you pivot to Asia. Oops, no, Syria will pivot back over there. Now it's pivoting to Russia. American people want to pivot to Ohio, of course. So now the world's in a different place. America finds itself unable to afford the grand dream that it was going to underwrite 30 years ago. And it wants to retreat. Now China has a different worldview. China took great advantage of the globalization project and turned itself into a behemoth, but it has no interest in building or even participating in such a global system whose rules it did not participate in writing in the first place. And that is, I think, the disconnect, where China is a great stakeholder in the system, yet it's a system whose rules China did not participate in writing. And if China wants a bigger role in the system, America is probably not willing to give them, because America has too much invested in the system they've built. So China wants a paradigm shift. China wants what it calls a new type of Daguo relations. And Daguo is translating to major power, which is, I think, is a troublesome translation, or major country. Daguo means a large nation state with a civilizational sphere of influence. And China is not big enough. It sees itself as a Daguo. Of course, America is a Daguo, European Union, maybe Russia, certainly. So China wants a new paradigm. And I think the world is moving towards a new paradigm. That's the secular trend, where nations are going to assert their own power, their own interests, without regards to the global architecture that the Western Alliance wants to sustain. Russia and Ukraine is the perfect case of that. And of course, I think China is sympathetic to Russia's interests and their desires when it comes to great Daguo, new power, great Daguo relations. And it's sort of like China's own Monroe Doctrine. So that, of course, speaks to China-Japan relations, China's policies in Southeast Asia. So all these things come into play, where America is trying hard to keep this crumbling global architecture afloat. And all these powers are now respecting this global architecture, and China being the biggest one and most effective one. And that is the fundamental fault line, and that is why we're all in trouble. I'll end here.
And actually, you've teed up another one of our questions for the audience about whether China, as a rising power, should be following the rules that already exist in the world and working within the existing framework if it wants to change them, or whether it's appropriate for it to push to have a different set of rules. We didn't set these initial rules. We're a major stakeholder now. We should be able to change the game, not just play within the existing game. So go ahead and send in your opinion. And in terms of sending things in, please also feel free to write questions and pass them in, and will be fielding those two in a moment. But while we're waiting for you to answer, Chengwei, what do you think in answer to this question? In answer to the question, should China as a rising power play by the rules of the existing system, or is it right for it to push for a different kind of system?
Well, no, I think China largely will follow that system, and it's not a complete challenge. At the same time, China wants to be a participant on what Chinese call on the head table, to have its say, because it's growing economic and regional influence. So I think it's a fair statement. Now, I agree with Eric that China, to a certain extent, is still, trying to figure out what's the best way to do. On the one hand, China increasingly recognizes its importance, and also because of China's need for natural resources, and energy and etc. They understand China should not be an insulated country, and China's future largely depends on the world, whether South America, Africa, or North America, and etc. So, but at the same time, China hesitant to be the leader or even G2 at the moment. And so therefore, I don't think China is a revolutionary, figure or player, but wanted to a little bit reform that the system in its own advantage. So in that period, this is China's leader's mindset.
Professor Jia, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, or?
Since the opening of China in 1979, China has been increasingly a conformer and also a reformer of the existing international order. China used to be an outsider. China used to have nothing to do with the existing international order because of the U.S.-led policy of containment and isolation of China on the part of the West. But since the early 70s, China has changed. Over time, China has become a stakeholder in the existing arrangement. China's reforms and policy and openness policy, and also China's development over the past 3 decades or more, has been part and parcel, a process of integration with the existing international arrangements system, participating in the existing international order. Now China has become a strong advocate of the authority of the United Nations. China has become a strong advocate of the so-called international law. China has participated increasingly in various kinds of international activities, including peacekeeping operations. And China has paid increasingly to support the existing international order. UN dues. China is more, forthcoming in pay the checks than the U.S. In many ways. Despite the fact China is still much poorer than the U.S. So China, I think, not only conforms and reforms the existing, tries to reform the existing institutions. China does this not as a tactic, but also as a sort of reflection of its identification with the existing international order. In terms of values, China has changed a great deal over the past 35 plus years. Okay. We used to have a central planned economy. Now we embrace the market economy. We used to have a personal rule. Now we embrace rule of law, even though in practice we still have a lot of problems. We used to reject human rights as something bourgeois. Now it's part of the so-called goal of the Chinese government to promote and improve the human rights situation in China. Of course, our priorities are a little bit different from those expected in the US. And China used to reject democracy as something capitalist. Now China is saying it wants to have democracy is a good thing. So we have come a long way since the Cultural Revolutionary days. So if these values are things that support the existing international order, I think certainly China has become part of it. China has identified with it. Recently, Chinese government came up with this 24 character core values, in which you find democracy, freedom, justice, and all these so-called universal values. Despite the fact that there is a big debate in China, that some leftist people condemn this, argue that we should not have something like universal values. This is a big trick on the part of the West to undermine China.
Well, universities have been told not to discuss some of these things.
Well, China, as I said, is in the middle of transition. We have dual sets of identities and interests. You have all kinds of views in China. Okay, even in the Central Party school. Okay, that's a very pluralistic place. Okay, when you look at China, don't look at one aspect of it. China is a really complicated place.
It contains multiple.
We used to say that U.S. is a pluralistic society often, and now I argue that China is more pluralistic than the U.S. In the U.S., you have a mainstream. Basically, mainstream share a certain set of values. In China, pluralism takes place in the mainstream. In the Central Party school, you have all kinds of isms in the Central Party school. China is no longer the China you know before.
David, bringing this back to strategic trust between the U.S. and China, but still staying with the rules of the game, the international system. There is a perception in some quarters in the States that China doesn't play by the rules very well. Chinese can then turn around and say, well, you complain that we steal intellectual property. What did the U.S. do when it was in its early stages of development? You complain that we do cyber espionage. What are you doing? I mean, look at what Edward Snowden had to say. Do you think that some of these concerns are justified? Do you think that there's a gap in terms of how to move forward together where there's, if not trust, at least predictable expectations about what your relationship will be like? Where's the gap?
Well, I guess the first thing is, it occurs to me that big nations are more likely to play by the rules when they see advantage in doing it, and less committed to those rules when they see disadvantage. And in that sense, maybe there's not as big a gap between the behavior of the U.S. and China as we might think. So I think that's kind of the nature of the international system. I associate myself with I won't repeat, but I associate myself with the remarks, and I think they were very wise, that Qingguo just gave. The United States is a very pluralistic place, but China, in some sense, I think, is more so. And if we're going to call for democracy and expression in China, whatever we mean by those words, certainly it's premised on the idea of having a decent respect for the range of views that exist in China. So it would be really rather surprising if, as China changes its political condition, we don't hear more views. Some are friendly to our ears and others aren't. Now, what I really wanted to say is I think we don't want to overemphasize the conflicts here. It seems to me there are a lot of things pulling us together, and you said stakeholder. I think China's a stakeholder in very many ways, and importantly so, but not always. But what's pulling us together? Economic globalization. I mean, I'm sorry, but I think China has benefited enormously from the open international economic system. The United States, granted, it took 16 years to get negotiated with China into the WTO, but just look at any graph of trade and it explodes from the year 2001. So that whole economic area, the United States China would not be where it is in economic terms if the United States had not been somewhat accommodating and all our allies and opening our market and foreign exchange and so forth. So, I mean, I think we're going way too far and that economic factor in our relationships is important. Secondly, I think it's been underemphasized. The United States has been fairly accommodating in many important ways to China in the international system. We've certainly gone along with increasing the vote and control and in the World Bank system would just be one example. We negotiate with China over many strategic issues, Iraq, Libya, and everything else. We modified our policies in light of that. In many cases, we haven't actually pursued the policy we wanted because China pulled us back, if that's the right phraseology. So I think I would emphasize the important things pulling us together, and we haven't been universally accommodating to China, but we haven't been universally not accommodating to China. And then I would say, what do you expect from two very big powers covering continents, different social structure? So I have a much higher evaluation of both where we are and our future than I think I discerned in Eric's views.
Yeah. You both talked about pluralism within China, and certainly it was my experience as well that speaking one-on-one with people, there are many different views. People are quite robust in expressing their points of view and exploring new points of view. That doesn't always carry over to the public sphere. If anything, censorship recently seems to have gotten a little bit tighter. And intellectuals have been told to limit the things they say on things like rule of law, democracy, etc. Do you see that changing? And what do you think it would take for it to change?
Well, I think overall there is if you take a historical long-term approach, you see that China is moving from this personalized rule to a more rule of law kind of arrangement. But in the process, I think you see a lot of contradictions. Okay? Last December, or the December before, Xi Jinping gave a speech, important speech in the anniversary of the 82 Constitution. We have 4 versions of the Constitution, 82 Constitution, and in which he clarified the relationship between the party and the Constitution and the so-called fundamental interests of the people. He said, basically, the party leads the people to write Constitution and laws, okay, according to the fundamental interests of the people. The party, as the ruling party, must execute or ensure implementation of the law, full implementation of the Constitution and the laws. And thirdly, party, as the ruling party, must be a model of observing the Constitution and laws. So he was there advocating rule of law very strongly. But then you see the document passing around, circular, saying that you cannot talk about this, you cannot talk about that. So we see different messages coming out of the political apparatus. But I think there are efforts to make sure that these certain views are not going to jeopardize political stability. But in general, I think. Comparing to the past, this is a much better situation than before.
Let me ask one more question of you all. I think the question is the extent to which domestic opinion, both in China and in the United States, affect the international relationship. And obviously domestic opinion in China is somewhat filtered through censorship, but also there's a lot of robust discussion and very frank discussion on Weibo and in social media. And while you're doing that, let's go to a couple of questions from the audience. One of them is, what is the impact of China's aging population on its strategic plans for economic ascendancy? And does this make it more pugnacious? Eric, why don't I start with you? You haven't spoken for a while.
I think they were a little late in correcting this one-child policy, probably by a good 10 years, maybe longer. So the there's a demographic challenge in the medium term, it seems. And luckily, I think they've realized that, they've corrected it, and hopefully in the much longer term, it'll come back into balance. But the demographic shift certainly, I think, coincides with the economic agenda of the current leadership, urbanization, more welfare spending. They unified the tax code, so the central government is getting a lot more money than before. So I think a more consumer spending in health, education. So the shifting demographics, I think, is consistent with the economic policies they're pursuing.
Well, I just want to add one thing. That 5 years ago, China's medical insurance coverage is about 20% of the population. 5 years later, now it's about over 80%. So this is a remarkable achievement. You may be cynical about the nature of this coverage, but the percentage, 60 points increase within 5 years. Now, we talk about Obama health plan. I think we should have some kind of humility to all these kind of achievements in China. Of course, China faces problems, serious problems, environment, food safety, economic disparity, corruption, and etc. But again, at the same time, leadership also try to do a lot of things before too late. So in that area, because of insurance coverage related with aging society, related with demographic challenges in the future. And now the next wave, as I said early on, is green consumption. It's very much on the top of our agenda. So that's the background I wanted to answer your question.
So the second part of the question was, does this do? I think the question, is the aging population and maybe the problems, the challenges that it poses, but it also sort of stands in for a question of domestic challenges the government's dealing with. Does that make it more pugnacious? Was the second part of the question. David, do you have anything you'd like to share on that?
Well, I think the massive intro, I said that no American should want to trade this set of problems that China's leaders face. I mean, demographics is just the beginning of it. Inverted age pyramid, female-male imbalance, lots of things associated with that. But mounting and escalating healthcare costs for chronically, as people get older, chronic disease, and that's going to be more and more expensive than for treating young people. But there are other entire categories of problems. Water in the North China Plain is sinking by a meter a year. If China's strategy is just building infrastructure to take it from the south and go to the north, I think it's got some long-term problems, to put it mildly. So just the distribution of resources there. China's going to pay very high costs for this air pollution. People are paying to get out of town earlier and not stay. A whole set of problems there. Does that make China more pugnacious, is your core question? I think in the long run it has to, and it does mean China really, the center of gravity of decision making, I still think needs to be minimize external problems to focus internally. And I think there is a big constituency for that in China. And the United States should be pursuing a policy that facilitates China paying attention to its domestic problems. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't people who draw pugnacious conclusions in actually both societies, but certainly in China. But I don't think that's the center of gravity in China or popularly.
We have a question for you on the same issue. Does China's international policy get affected by its domestic concerns? I guess we're going straight to the question on the zero-sum game. So this is the question we asked at the very beginning. If you could just say, has anything you heard here changed your opinion on that question? You can vote the way you did before, or if your opinion's been changed, vote the other way. Let's see what happens. It was like 70 something. Okay. Well, there you are. So I would like to thank all of our panelists for their thoughtful, insightful comments. And thank you all very much for being here.
So have we moved the needle? 2% of you changed your mind. Good. I would advise you now is lunchtime as we exit this.